The Day After is an American television film that first aired on November 20, 1983, on the ABC television network. More than 100 million people had seen the program during its initial broadcast. It is currently the highest-rated television film in history. The film postulates a fictional war between NATO forces and the Warsaw Pact that rapidly escalates into a full-scale nuclear exchange between the United States and the Soviet Union. However, the action itself focuses on the residents of Lawrence, Kansas and Kansas City, Missouri, as well as several family farms situated near nuclear missile silos. The cast includes Jobeth Williams, Steve Guttenberg, John Cullum, Jason Robards, and John Lithgow. The film was written by Edward Hume, produced by Robert Papazian, and directed by Nicholas Meyer. It was released on DVD on May 18, 2004, by MGM. Storyline. Background on the war. The chronology of the events leading up to the war is depicted entirely via television and radio news broadcasts, and characters' reactions to them. The Soviet Union is shown to have commenced a military build-up in East Germany with the goal of intimidating the United States into withdrawing from West Berlin. When the United States does not back down, Soviet armored divisions are sent to the border between West and East Germany. During the late hours of Friday, September 15, news broadcasts report a widespread rebellion among several divisions of the East German army. As a result, the Soviets blockade West Berlin. Tensions mount, and the United States issues an ultimatum that the Soviets stand down from the blockade by 6 a.m. the next day. Non-compliance will be interpreted as an act of war. The Soviets refuse, and the President of the United States orders all U.S. military forces around the world on alert. On Saturday, September 16, NATO forces in West Germany invade East Germany through the Helmstedt checkpoint to free Berlin. The Soviets hold the Marienborn corridor and inflict heavy casualties on NATO troops. 2 Soviet MiG-25s cross into West German airspace and bomb a NATO munitions storage facility, also striking a school and a hospital. A subsequent radio broadcast states that Moscow is being evacuated. At this point, major U.S. cities begin mass evacuations as well. There soon follow unconfirmed reports that nuclear weapons were used in Wiesbaden and Frankfurt. Meanwhile, in the Persian Gulf, naval warfare erupts, as radio reports tell of ship sinkings on both sides. Eventually, the Soviet army reaches the Rhine, seeking to prevent Soviet forces from invading France and causing the rest of Western Europe to fall. NATO halts the Soviet advance by airbursting 3 low-yield tactical nuclear weapons over advancing Soviet troops. Soviet forces counter by launching a nuclear strike on NATO headquarters in Brussels. In response, the United States Strategic Air Command begins scrambling B-52 bombers. The Soviet Air Force then destroys a BMEWS station in RAF Fylingdales, England, and another at Beale Air Force Base in California. Meanwhile, on board the C-135 Looking Glass aircraft, the order comes in from the President of the United States for a full nuclear strike against the Soviet Union. Almost simultaneously, an Air Force officer receives a report that a massive Soviet nuclear assault against the United States has been launched, stating 32 targets in track, with 10 impacting points. Another airman receives a report that over 300 Soviet ICBMs are inbound. It is deliberately unclear in the film whether the Soviet Union or the United States launches the main nuclear attack first. The first salvo of the Soviet nuclear attack on the central United States occurs at 3:38 p.m. Central Daylight Time, when a large-yield nuclear weapon airbursts at high altitude over Kansas City, Missouri. This generates an electromagnetic pulse that shuts down the electric power grid of the surrounding area. 30 seconds later, incoming Soviet ICBMs begin to hit military and population targets, including the Missouri municipalities Kansas City, Sedalia, and all the way south to El Dorado Springs, which are blanketed with ground-burst nuclear weapons. While the story provides no specifics, it strongly suggests that America's cities, military, and industrial bases are heavily damaged or destroyed. The aftermath depicts the central United States as a blackened wasteland of burned-out cities filled with burn, blast, and radiation victims. Eventually, the U.S. President delivers a radio address in which he declares there is now a ceasefire between the United States and the Soviet Union and states there has not been and will not ever be a surrender by the United States. Plot: the story follows several citizens and people they encounter after a nuclear attack on Lawrence, Kansas and Kansas City, Missouri. The film's narrative is structured as a before, during, after scenario. The first segment introduces the various characters and their stories, the second shows the nuclear disaster itself, and the third details the effects of the fallout on the characters. Dr. Russell Oakes lives in the upper-class Brookside neighborhood with his wife and works in a hospital in downtown Kansas City. He is scheduled to teach a hematology class at the University of Kansas Hospital in nearby Lawrence, Kansas, and is en route when he hears an alarming emergency broadcast system alert on his car radio. He exits the crowded freeway and attempts to contact his wife but gives up due to the long line at a phone booth. Oakes attempts to return to his home via the K-10 freeway and is the only eastbound motorist. The nuclear attack begins, and Kansas City is gripped with panic as air raid sirens wail. Oakes' car is permanently disabled by the electromagnetic pulse from the first high-altitude detonation, as are all motor vehicles and electricity. Oakes is about 30 miles away from downtown when the missiles hit. His family, many colleagues, and almost all of Kansas City's population are killed. He walks 10 miles to Lawrence, which has been severely damaged from the blasts, and, at the university hospital, treats the wounded with Dr. Sam Hashia and nurse Nancy Bauer. Also at the university, science professor Joe Huxley and students use a Geiger counter to monitor the level of nuclear fallout outside. They build a makeshift radio to maintain contact with Dr. Oakes at the hospital as well as to locate any other broadcasting survivors outside the city. Billy McCoy is an airman first class in the United States Air Force, stationed at Whiteman AFB near Kansas City, and is called to duty during the DEFCON 2 alert. As a missile repair technician at a silo, he is among the first to witness the initial missile launches, indicating full-scale nuclear war. After it becomes clear that a Soviet counter-strike is imminent, the soldiers panic. Several airmen stubbornly insist that they should stay at their post on duty and take shelter in the silo, while others, including McCoy, point out that it is futile because the silo will not withstand a direct hit. McCoy tells them they have done their jobs and speeds away in an Air Force truck to retrieve his wife and child in Sedalia. But the truck is permanently disabled and stalls from the EMP effect of the first high-altitude detonation. Realizing what has happened, McCoy abandons the truck and takes shelter inside an overturned semi-truck trailer, barely escaping the oncoming nuclear blast. After the attack, McCoy walks towards a town and finds an abandoned store, where he takes candy bars and other provisions. While gunfire is heard in the distance. While standing in line for a drink of water from a well pump, McCoy befriends a man who is mute and shares his provisions. McCoy asks another man, who is walking along the road with other injured survivors, what happened to Sedalia, and the man indicates that Sedalia and Windsor no longer exist. As McCoy and his companion both begin to suffer the effects of radiation sickness, they leave a refugee camp and head to the hospital at Lawrence, where McCoy ultimately succumbs to the radiation sickness. Farmer Jim Dahlberg and his family live in rural Harrisonville, Missouri. about 37 miles from Kansas City but very close to a field of missile silos. While the family is preparing for the wedding of their elder daughter, Denise, to Senior Bruce Gallatin, Jim is forced to prepare for the impending attack by converting their basement into a makeshift fallout shelter. As the missiles are launched, he forcefully carries his wife Eve, who refuses to accept the reality of the escalating crisis and continues making wedding preparations, downstairs into the basement. While running to the shelter, the Dahlberg's son, Danny, inadvertently looks directly at a nuclear explosion and is flash-blinded. A student, Stephen Klein, while hitchhiking home to Joplin, Missouri, stumbles upon the farm and persuades the Dahlbergs to take him in. After several days in the basement, Denise, distraught over the situation and the unknown whereabouts of Bruce, who, unbeknownst to her, was killed in the attack, escapes from the basement and runs about the field that is cluttered with dead animals. She sees a clear blue sky and thinks the worst is over. However, the field is actually covered in radioactive fallout. Klein goes after her, attempting to warn her about the effects of the nuclear radiation that, though invisible, intangible, and tasteless, is going through her cells like X-rays, but Denise, ignoring this warning, tries to run from him. Eventually, Klein is able to chase Denise back to safety in the basement, but not before Denise runs to the stairs to find her wedding dress. Because she ran about the contaminated field, Denise slowly develops radiation sickness and, during a makeshift church service, she begins to bleed externally. While the minister tries to express how lucky they are to have survived, and a presidential address remarks that there is a ceasefire between the United States and the Soviet Union, which has suffered similar damage, and states that there has not been and will not ever be a surrender by the United States. Klein takes Danny and Denise to Lawrence for treatment. Dr. Hishiya unsuccessfully attempts to treat Danny, and Klein also develops radiation sickness. Dahlberg, upon returning from an emergency farmers' meeting, confronts a group of survivors squatting on his farm and is shot and killed. Ultimately, the situation at the hospital becomes grim. Dr. Oakes collapses from exhaustion and, upon awakening several days later, learns that Nurse Bauer has died from meningitis. Oakes, suffering from terminal radiation sickness, decides to return to Kansas City to see his home for the last time. While Hishiya stays behind. Oakes hitches a ride on an Army National Guard truck, where he witnesses military personnel blindfolding and executing looters. After somehow managing to locate where his home was, he finds the charred remains of his wife's wristwatch and a family huddled in the ruins. Oakes angrily orders them to leave his home. The family silently offers Oakes food, causing him to collapse in despair. As a member of the family comforts him. As the scene fades to black, Professor Huxley calls into his makeshift radio. "Hello? Is anybody there? Anybody at all?" There is no response.